All right, well, thanks for dropping along tonight, and thanks to Mellisons for the use of this great facility this evening. It's King and Wood Mellisons. It's greatly appreciated. It's a great facility here to use. On the occasion of the launch of Anne Henderson, Menzies versus Evatt, the great rivalry of Australian politics, published by Connor Court and just out today. And we're particularly honoured at the Sydney Institute to have two good friends of the Institute, John Howard and Michael Kirby, who've spoken here on many occasions in the past over 3 decades or more, but it's terrific to have them here tonight. They're so well known, I won't take up any time. The Honourable John Howard AC, former Prime Minister of Australia, the Honourable Justice Michael Kirby AC, former Justice of the High Court of Australia, launching Menzies versus Evatt, Australia's great political rivalry. John Howard, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Gerard. It's great to be here, and it's great to share a platform with Michael Kirby. Michael and I haven't always agreed, but we have sometimes agreed, and I think we both remember with some affection having seen off the Roundheads some 20 or more years ago in the Republican referendum. But I won't dwell on that. I simply want to say that this book has long been overdue for writing. I have a little bit of a personal interest in the story. I grew up, and Michael did too, at a time when these two men dominated the Australian political scene. As Anne records, their great standoff over the referendum to ban the Communist Party brought about the only occasion, to my knowledge, that my parents voted differently in a ballot. My father voted yes, and my mother voted no, and she did so very emphatically. And I remember a fairly short, sharp exchange around the kitchen table, ending with saying, "Lyle, I don't care what you say, I'm voting no." That was the end of it. I was 12 at the time, and I sort of listened respectfully, but I do remember it very vividly. And on a rather more sombre note, the last time I recall listening to Parliament with my long-dead father was in October of 1955, when we listened to Bert Evatt's long statement to Parliament addressing the final report of the Royal Commission established after the Petrov defection. And it was during that speech that he produced extraordinary gasps of amazement when he indicated that he had written to Molotov, who was still the Soviet foreign minister, and of course the infamous author, along with Ribbentrop, of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact concluded between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia on the eve of the outbreak of World War II, and of course before Hitler violated the agreement with his Operation Barbarossa, the attack on the Soviet Union, which resulted in the deaths in military conflict or otherwise, of some 27 million Soviet citizens. So I remember that very, very vividly, and my father died just a few weeks after that. And we had grown accustomed at that time of listening to Parliament together. And we were a little surprised, and it reinforced our views of Dr. Evatt, politically speaking. He was an interesting man, and I had the very interesting experience between my completing the leaving certificate and commencing my law degree in early 1957 of working as a messenger boy for a barrister's clerk on the second floor of Denman Chambers. And one of the suites there, or one of the chambers rather, was occupied by Bert Evatt and his brother Clive. And they were an interesting contrast. Very, very different personalities. Clive was he appeared to be the bon vivant of the family, and they were very, very interesting. And I sensed then, and I've remembered it a lot since, that Evatt at that time, of course, was going through the political horrors That was December of 1956. The Labor Party had split the previous year. He had lost the 1955 election, and moves were then underway, of course, to have him installed as Chief Justice of New South Wales. They were both quite remarkable men, and they were, of course, about as near to contemporaries as you could get, born barely a year apart. And they both had great academic careers. I think it's fair to say that Evatt's academic career excelled that of Menzies, although Menzies' career at the bar was quite stellar, appearing as he famously did in the engineer's case at the age of only, 25. It is written by Anne, and I have no reason to disbelieve it, that Evatt's mother was very keen on his academic achievements, and she had every reason to be proud of them. And his early forays into politics were very spectacular. He won the seat of Barton, in which my old family home of Elwood is now located, with a swing of 13.9% on a two-party basis in 1940. And he was seen then, and understandably so, as very much a rising star. And his performance on the international stage, where he was the first president of the United Nations General Assembly and played a major role in the resolutions of the General Assembly that brought into being the State of Israel, an issue, of course, which is now very much in the news because of the changes, apparent changes in the policy of the government regarding the recognition of a Palestinian state. He was a dominant figure both legally and internationally. He personally appeared for the government in bank nationalisation cases. It is said, I don't know whether it's really that accurate, it sounds a bit extraordinary, that he addressed the Privy Council for about 13 days in the bank nationalisation case. And it's also recorded, and this can be checked, but I think it's right, the two members of the Privy Council died during the case. Now, there will be people in the audience who will know whether that's right or wrong. I see from a few nodding heads that it could well be close to the truth. He was not as good a public orator as Menzies. Menzies certainly surpassed him with his rapier wit and his lordly presentation style. But there can be no doubt that Bert Evatt deserved an important place, not only in the history of the Australian Labor Party, but also in Australian history generally. And the fact that their two careers intersected so much added a bit of real colour. Who was right and who was wrong? Well, it depends on what period you are looking at. There's no doubt that the occasion of the referendum to ban the Communist Party represented the high point of Evatt's supremacy over Menzies. It's interesting that some months out from the referendum, opinion polls were recording 70 to 80% in favour of the yes vote. And it seemed astonishing that the yes vote could lose, because this was September of 1951. The big worry was that Soviet communism, having never vacated the areas of Eastern Europe from which the Nazis had been expelled, the fall of the Chiang Kai-shek regime in China only 2 years previously, and a general concern about the communist control of trade unions, which of course was beginning then to cause internal tensions inside the Labor Party through the activities of the industrial groups the growing influence of B.A. Santa Maria and others who argued for a stronger resistance to communism. One of the interesting things about this period is that the attitude of the British Labour Party, which was then in government under Clement Attlee, and the Foreign Secretary was a fellow called Ernest Bevin, not to be mistaken with an Iron Bevan. He was far more anti-communist than his counterparts in the Australian Labor Party. That government was far more obsessed with the Soviet threat. And that was understandable because they were in Europe and we were a long way away, and we were yet to become concerned, although we would very rapidly, concerned about the spread of communist influence in Southeast Asia. And this was an area of departure between Evatt and his counterparts in the Labor government until 1949, and more intensively, of course, the coalition government after 1951. Evatt was a person who placed enormous store on human rights, and he believed passionately that the legislation that Menzies had put up, which I thought, and I think I've reflected this in the book I wrote about the Menzies period, that it went unnecessarily beyond what was needed to restore or to achieve what was the aim of the legislation declared invalid by the High Court of Australia some months previously. So it was a titanic struggle. It's fair to say that it ended with many sad aspects because of the circumstances in which Evatt was appointed as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and the fact that he had to resign that position because of failing health. But he did make a huge contribution to the Labor Party, gave it massive profile internationally, but there is little doubt that his extraordinary claim in that speech he made in October of 1955, that the Australian public should believe the word of Molotov against that of three respected Australian judges, condemned him in the eyes of many people as having extremely bad judgment. And I think this is a fascinating book. Oddly enough, notwithstanding my political tribalism, I had more personal acquaintance with Bert Evatt than I did with Bob Menzies, who I met on only one occasion at a cocktail party at the Lodge in the middle 1960s, and I was an insignificant delegate from the New South Wales branch to a gathering of the Federal Council of the Liberal Party. Because I admired Menzies from a distance, but I have grown to respect the prodigious commitment of Herbert Vere Evatt to the cause of human rights, and I admire what he achieved in that referendum. Because I can remember I was 12 years of age, but I was precociously following it very closely. And I remember the day after, my Sunday school teacher was a very good Labor man, very decent fellow, good Christian man, but he sort of said, "Hey, what do you think of the result, John?" And I said, counting's not over yet. I was sort of, must have been echoing the comments of my father, certainly not of my mother, although they didn't continue the debate. They just had their little démarche and that was it. But it was a titanic struggle, and I think those of us who follow politics very closely owe Anne a debt for having written this, and written it in the context of the fact that they were contemporaries and they fought each other doggedly, with some wins and some losses. I have one mildly, not critical, but mildly inquiring observation, let me put it that way. There's no reference in the book, as I could find, to that landmark commerce agreement between Japan and Australia, to which we must be indebted, above all, to John McEwen. I mean, I look back on Australia's engagement with Asia. There are some, maybe some in this audience, who would argue that our engagement really didn't start till 1972, but our real engagement with Asia post-World War II was when we signed that agreement. And remember that our parliament then contained a large number of men who had fought the Japanese but 10 or 12 years previously. Many of them, such as Alec Downer, Reg Swartz, later Tom Uren, both sides of politics had been prisoners of war, but we rose above that as a nation and signed this commerce agreement, and it paved the way for the expansion of our trade with North Asia once Britain turned her back on imperial preference and entered the common market, a decision that she finally had opportunity to recant many years later with Brexit, but that's another matter. So, and thank you very much for what you've done. I think it's a great read, and I am delighted that I share the platform with Michael. We've partnered each other on platforms, disagreed on things, but always retained a very warm affection for each other and our commitment to political combat in the best sense of that word. Thank you.
Well, many thanks, John Howard. Michael Kirby, thank you.
I pay respects to the First Nations people, as has become a practice in Australia, and I pay a particular respect to John Howard and his great distinction. It's wonderful to be here with him, and to Anne for this excellent book. Now, I didn't become the most popular book launcher in Australia, succeeding Barry Humphries, without taking great care to speak only about the book. And that's what I'm going to do, because it's a very readable book and none of you must go home without buying it. The whole point of a book launch is to sell books. If you read the book, you'll see, as John Howard has just said, the very great similarities between these two giants. And they were giants of our youth, and they are still very important figures in our history. Both of them born in 1894 in colonial Australia. Both of them younger sons in their families. Menzies the fourth, Evatt the fifth in his. Both of them in rather modest domestic family situations. Both of them in regional and rural Australia. Both of them by religion Protestant Christians. Both of them beginning their education in the local public school. Like John Howard and me, they were each of them products of that great experiment in colonial and post-colonial Australia of public education. The common factor in their personalities was a certain vanity, but they had been extremely successful in their schooling and in university, and that led to a certain arrogance on the part of both of them, but perhaps you don't really get far in this world unless you've got a great confidence in yourself. Both of them served in their state parliament. Both of them became top lawyers, King's Counsel. Both of them had a big practice before the High Court of Australia and argued very influential cases. Both of them had a stable and loving family life, which is so important in going ahead and achieving things. Mary Alice Sheffer, known as Mass, M-A-S, Dame Patty, whom we all remember. Both of them were elected members of the House of Representatives. Both of them became Federal Attorney General. Both of them were active in the early part of the war in combating communist activity and in the case of Evatt, as the Federal Attorney General, putting communists in jail because they were interfering with the war plans of Australia. Both of them were appointed to the Privy Council. Each of them was a Right Honourable. Both of them accepted constitutional monarchy, though Menzies was to embrace it with great enthusiasm, as is pointed out in Anne Henderson's book. Evatt was probably closer to Chifley's view that constitutional monarchy was a handy constitutional fiction for a country like Australia. Both of them were overshadowed in times in opposition, and both of them had down times and hard times and dark times, but both of them had moments of glory in their political life. Both of them are buried, or their remains are buried in public cemeteries, and neither of them should be stereotyped. Each of them is a very important Australian historical figure, and the wonder of this book is that Anne has brought out all of these facts in a marvellous analysis of these two very strong personalities who played a great part in our history in the middle of the last century. But there were differences, and Anne brings the differences out. Menzies won a scholarship and went for secondary school to Wesley College in Melbourne. That was pretty close to the Presbyterians, but he gave him an appreciation of private schools. Both of them had played a part in the judiciary, but Evatt had been a Justice of the High Court for 10 years and later Chief Justice of New South Wales for 2 years. Menzies never served on the judiciary, but he had very close friendships with many of the justices of the High Court, including Latham, who had been a member of the Federal Parliament in the coalition or the Conservative side, and was a sort of model in many ways for Evatt, for Menzies as the lawyer. Menzies was a person who embraced a relationship with the Catholic community and supported state aid to church schools. Evatt had a very rough and difficult relationship with the Roman Catholic Church. Now, Anne takes a point on the fact that Dr. Burton kept referring to the Catholic Church as the Roman Catholic Church. She doesn't like that. But if you've been brought up as an Anglican or in any Christian denomination and you declare that you are a believer in the Holy Catholic Church, you've got to draw a distinction, Anne, between the Roman Catholic Church and the rest of us who are members of the Holy Apostolic Catholic Church. And that's why Dr. Burton was doing it. A big difference between them was, as Anne points out, that Menzies had a great scepticism about the United Nations. Bert Evatt had really been one of the founders of the United Nations. He went when they were drafting the Charter of the United Nations. He played a very important part fighting for the little states like Australia. And he played an important part in the negotiation that led to the P5, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, without which we probably wouldn't have had the United Nations, because that was necessary to get the United Nations, to get the United States into the United Nations. They had never joined the League. Menzies paid annual visits to the United Kingdom. He was very, very keen, as a certain other person here was, in cricket. And he received his presentation by the Queen of his role as the commander of the Cinque Ports in the long room of the Melbourne Cricket Ground. Such was his great devotion to cricket. And Menzies was an important imperial Australian, and his international activities, as is pointed out in the book, were largely international. That was congenial to him. As Anne points out, he was very sceptical about the United Nations. Evatt was idealistic about the United Nations. And Evatt played an important role, as John Howard has pointed out, in the development of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, whose 75th anniversary will be celebrated later this year, on the 10th of December. So, but I think a very important part, a point of difference that's brought out in the book, is that fundamentally Menzies was a better politician. And that was reinforced by the fact that Menzies was an extremely important team player. And he played a role in the establishment of the Liberal Party of Australia, which over the long haul has been the most successful political party in the country. That was a difference. Anne repeatedly says, when analysing activities of Evatt, it was all about him. It was all about his personality, all about his ego, and his very considerable achievements. And she brings out also the fact that he looked at problems too much as a lawyer. And that was a big mistake. Even calling on Mr. Molotov to provide details of the documents which were alleged to be the basis of the cell of communists in his office and in other high offices in Australia. That was really Evatt the lawyer saying, audi alteram partem, hear the other side. But that wasn't a very convincing view from the Australian public. And as John Howard said, it was probably the beginning of the end for his credibility. So if I look at the book, I think it's a wonderful presentation of the personalities of the two central figures who are examined in the book. And it is a fair analysis, and it's a very readable account, and therefore I commend it and launch it. I think Anne has been a bit too hard on the importance of the two men looking back at it from 2023. Looking back at it from 2023 to Menzies, the imperial figure, and Evatt the United Nations figure. I think many would think that the United Nations, for all of its faults, was an important component of the world community, without which we couldn't deal with the problem of nuclear weapons, even as imperfectly as we have. We couldn't deal with the problems of pandemics, even as imperfectly as we often have. We couldn't deal with the problems of climate change, even though we haven't succeeded in that. And therefore, that in a sense, Menzies was yesterday's man and Evatt was beckoning us to try to build a better international community that would try to deal with and have the resources and the role to deal with the big problems that face us today. So a very interesting read. Like John, I would always listen to the federal broadcasts, and I hope they always continue to provide the federal broadcasts of our parliament. And I would listen to these two men, and I was proud as a young Australian, even then, of these two men as politicians, political leaders, who presented us with a real difference and a real choice and real opportunities to think about politics. And that is brought out in Anne Henderson's book. So I commend it to you all. Don't go home without buying a copy.
Anne, could you come roaming up to the microphone?
Well, what an act to follow. Who am I to stand here? Look, to these two icons of Australian political and legal life, it's an honour to have you here. I can't thank you enough. And I take your points. I'll do better next time on a couple of issues. To Connor Court and Anthony Capello, my very big thanks. A fine product that Anthony manages to get out in a matter of a couple of months, where other publishers take a year to year and a half, if you're lucky. And to Paige Helly, our good Paige from the Sydney Institute, wherever she may be sitting, a terrific cover and bouquets to you. I'll just explain where the book started. Being the year of The Voice, I was looking back last year on one of the most divisive referendums of Australia. We had the conscription debates in World War I. The 1951 referendum on the Communist Party dissolution ended with a very close vote after a very, very bitter campaign. And like now, there were many elements to it. The Labor Party had its own vote yes group. The Liberal Party had some that wanted to vote no. But it's 2 months out, 70 to 80% of people were ready to vote yes. And yet it went down very narrowly. So, doing this, I interviewed both of these two sterling figures of our recent past and present, and they could recall the atmospherics of the campaign, which is very important. I wasn't born. Yes, I was born, but I was running around in diapers, I think. There was Prime Minister Menzies for the yes and Doc Evatt for the no. I also exchanged emails with Penelope Seidler, who, as you know, is the niece of Bert Evatt, and she could remember being made to feel very much an outsider at her very posh private girls' school. In one of the PM's rowdiest meetings, this will give you a flavour of the campaign, he was yelled at by a heckler and greeted, "Hail Hitler." And he replied, "You call me Hitler and Dr. Evels calls me Goebbels. Make up your mind." Can you imagine that kind of debate today? Not really. We've become a little more gentrified. But it was a very stormy divide. And I found as I did it, there was a much bigger story, and it hadn't been written about. And it was the story of the two leaders, Menzies and Evatt. And I take your point about the United Nations and deterrence, in defence. We have moved on, but we've moved on in stumbles. They contested 3 elections and one very big referendum. No 2 contestants in Australian history affected each other as much as Menzies and Evatt, but I could find no book that tracked that rivalry. Lord Carrington, who knew them both, he was High Commissioner for a while in Australia, he once wrote that all they had in common was their love of cricket. And I do agree with Michael Kirby, there was a lot of, you could say, comparisons about them. But Lord Carrington was, of course, talking about their personalities and their approach to politics. The book examines that divide and its consequences, because the rivalry was also personal. And it was bitter, and they didn't really like each other, unlike our 2 icons here, in the sense of getting on and being able to be convivial. There wasn't much conviviality between Evatt and Menzies. They were very intense at times. And it was especially intense when, after Evatt did so well and Menzies had done so poorly in the early 40s, that Robert Menzies emerged after wanting to leave politics, built the Liberal Party and won the 1949 election. At that point, Evatt goes down. He wants to leave politics. The Labor Party won't let him. And it's a pretty terrible thing to go from there to there in politics. But then he emerges as Labor leader in June 1951 when Ben Chifley died. Now, that's just before the referendum. Now, the friction and tension between the 2 really reaches its climax between 1951 and 1955. It was a time when the debate over communism in Australia and fears surrounding national security dominated national debate, especially with our closest allies and inevitably with us, with China going communist. And it got even worse with the defection of Vladimir and Evdokia Petrov in April 1951. Just before the May election. Bert Evatt had triumphed, absolutely, as Michael Kirby's pointed out, as one of the key figures in the establishment of the United Nations. But he truly believed it could bring world peace. And I agree that the United Nations is a feature of our continuing stability in government, but it hasn't brought world peace. And in the Cold War, with a change of vibe, as we say in digital life, the times changed from the World War II world where Russia was our ally to a Cold War where the Soviet Union was an aggressor. It was one that I found Evatt never quite adjusted to. In the 1950s, he continued to distrust what he called imperialist Japan, and he saw Soviet Russia as a reliable global citizen. I can't think who it was said that he never could accept that the cat in forest murders of those thousands of Polish officers had happened under the Soviet Union's authority. He always believed Germany had done it, and he was proved wrong again and again. He just couldn't accept that the Soviet Union was the aggressor it was. According to Paul Hasluck, Evatt thought Stalin, he said, had wanted to win the war, when in fact Stalin wanted to win the world. On the other hand, Menzies saw Soviet communism as the replacement for Nazism, the next ism we had to defend ourselves against. Now, the record shows that in the years the Chifley government was in power, Australia's External Affairs Department was viewed with suspicion in the UK and the US because of leaks out of the department over to the Soviets. Now, these leaks were established, or to be valid, through the Venona intercepts. But the Venona intercepts were not shared, or even the fact that they existed, for a long time with Australia. Chifley learned of them, I think, only in 1948. Shocked and horrified, he set up ASIO. But they didn't know the full story. They also mistrusted Evatt because of his softness on the Soviet Union, and the departmental head, John Burton, who gave cover to a couple of our worst spies. So Menzies became aware of this in his visit to the UK in 1948. And then it was that he made the promise to ban the Communist Party at the election of 1949. In office, he won back the trust of Australia by the UK and the US.
and he saw the overhaul of ASIO, which became much better, but had a long way to go. So by the time of the Petrov defection in April 1951, which Menzies only knew about a couple of weeks before, he had developed, because of this information that he was getting from overseas and wherever, he developed a belief that Bert Evatt was a national security risk. In 1954, he told Canberra journalist Frank Chamberlain that he would leave politics that year but for Dr. Evatt, whom he saw as a menace to Australia, now this is his mind, and must be kept out of office by hook or by crook. So that's how Menzies was feeling. Now, on the other side, I see the intensity of Evatt's rivalry with Menzies, whom he had this personal grudge with, increased his paranoia in the fallout from the Petrov Commission and the Petrov affair. It led him to become consumed by the Commission. He had 3 staffers, one of whom had to resign, 2 of whom he defended in the Commission. He came to see it all as a personal attack. He spent months on it while the party started to splinter, and caucus was in uproar, as it was in the late 1920s, where they said you could hear it through padded doors in Canberra, the Labor Party caucus. And that then, to me, was his real nadir. He never came back from that. As John Howard described, by late 1950, October 1955, he even was believing the Soviet foreign minister could give him valid information on the documents the Petrov had brought to Australia or handed over. Paul Kelly, in the foreword to the book, writes that the rivalry between Menzies and Evatt took on a Shakespearean quality. I would add that for Doc Evatt, it had the hallmarks of a Greek tragedy, and it was a tragedy that a man so accomplished would have ended up that way. And possibly he should have left politics if he'd lost the 54 election very narrowly for reasons of finance. It was all about making promises. Inflation was easy, and they were making promises they couldn't cost. So that's the book. Thank you all for coming. We wouldn't be here without you. But let's hear it for the 2 distinguished launchers here, John Howard and Michael Kirby. Thank you so much.
Well, many thanks. We've probably got a couple of minutes for some questions if anyone wants to ask them. Why don't you all come up here? And if you stand in the middle, I think, and the distinguished gentleman on either side.
I'll come up with the book.
Of a gilt frame.
You're very commercial, Michael. You could have been a travelling salesman if
Monarchist, after all.
you hadn't been a travelling monarchist. Yes, you could have been.
I'm the only Republican here.
Well, Gough Whitlam
Time.
never read the book.
Sorry about that.
Time.
You're
Hang on, there is a comment here about Gough Whitlam's book launches.
He never read the book. He always looked at the index to see if he was mentioned.
Who are you talking about?
Gough.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Aye.
But I read the book. That's the judicial training.
There was one book launch. I think it was one of our prominent publishers that Gough was launching. I think it was on contemporary Australian politics, and he was stuck in the Roman Empire at that stage. And the publisher yells out, "For God's sake, Gough, just launch the bloody book," which he did. It was before he got to the 10th century, I think, somewhere like that. Now, comments, questions. So can I just say, I mean, if you just had a couple of brief words, let's start with you, John, and then Anne and Michael. Brief comments on Menzies and Evatt. I mean, was Menzies just an imperial sort of guy, or was he a bit more than that?
No, he wasn't.
Were you talking to this now? Everyone moves away.
Yeah, right. Well, it's an unfair depiction of Menzies just to dismiss him as an old-fashioned imperialist. Look, he believed in the monarchy. He believed in British values. He felt a surge of enjoyment when he first arrived in Britain in the 1930s, because that was his upbringing, his background. But just remember that Menzies rebuffed the British when it came to the formation of the ANZUS Treaty. They wanted to be part of it. Menzies he might have liked Britain, but he always bought American when it came to defence equipment. And he was the Prime Minister who irretrievably committed this country to the most unpopular war it's ever been involved in, and that is the Vietnam War. Because without Menzies' decision to commit an infantry battalion in 1965 in response to the entreaties of a centre-left American president. I mean, remember this, that the biggest commitment made by this country to America militarily was done by a centre-right Prime Minister to a centre-left president. So, I mean, sure, he was unashamedly British to his boot heels. Of course, nothing wrong with that. It was the temper of the times. And, you know, I've often said that the luckiest thing that happened to this country was to be colonised by the British.
The Portuguese.
And it's true. They were better than the others who would have colonised us inevitably. So, you know, that's my view. I just defend him against the charge that you can write him off as just being an old-fashioned imperialist. There's a lot more to the bloke than that.
I can see your hand moving across there. I saw it.
Well,
I certainly agree that neither of these very distinguished Australian politicians should be stereotyped. And in fact, it's interesting that when he was arguing the referendum, Evatt repeatedly said that the fault of the legislation was that it was breaching the British values and British justice. Over and over he referred to that. And so the lesson is, as John has just said, that both of them were the products of their time, both of them were the products of their upbringing. Each of them brought their own values to their role, and each of them was a very, very clever person, a very clever. We've got to get more people of that calibre into our politics because that was something which, apart from everything else, made politics very exciting, interesting. And John, I think you were in China at one stage and somebody raised with you the referendum and you said, looking back on it, you thought it was a big mistake and that it shouldn't have been persisted with. And I think I saw hints of that in what you just said today.
Well, what I did say in China at that time, addressing a gathering of the cadres of the Chinese Communist Party, they said to me, how do you maintain that you want good relations with China when you meet the Dalai Lama? And I said to them that if we can have a referendum to ban the Communist Party and reject it, why can't you be comfortable with me meeting the Dalai Lama? I think the contrast was lost on my audience.
You want to make a comment on...
Look, as someone who voted yes in the Republican referendum, I fully appreciate... 1999. I fully appreciate Menzies' respect and continued support for our links with the British the British Westminster system and the way in which the law in Australia is conducted and the politics. And when you read those old Hansard debates, the quality of the speeches is amazing. Although they did go for a long time, 2 hours and so forth. But I respect that too. I find it very hard to lose that. I think it is stability plus, and there's great things in it. My feeling is, like Michael, I'm not like Michael, he's a monarchist, but I can be more conservative than Michael, but still think it's time for an Australian head of state. The problem is we haven't got an idea in our head of how we're going to make that work. And that's where the referendum went down and no one's solved the problem. So for the moment, let's make the best of what we got.
You sat on the High Court for a long time. You would have read many Evatt judgments. How do you think they stand up?
Actually, Isaacs, Evatt, Dixon, Windeyer, some justices tend to live and most don't. Some justices have a way of conceptualising the issue and seeing the problem of the time in a broader concept and a broader context. And Evatt, I believe, has stood up well amongst the justices of the High Court. He was a very smart man, and he wrote several very important books, The King and His Dominion Governors and so on, during the time that he was a justice of the High Court. He was a very able and a big achiever with a big ego to match. But his flaw was that he was a lawyer in politics, and he was a man who looked on problems in a legal way instead of in a political way.
Repeat the last bit you said. The problem was?
The problem was he was a lawyer in politics who looked at problems and how to solve them very much as a lawyer instead of as a politician, and he wasn't really a team player. And that's the point that Anne brings out in the book, that he was a man where, as she rather unkindly, but I think accurately said, it was all about him. And actually, Sir Paul Hasluck, quoted in the book, said that he was a man who was a child, and having a child's desire to achieve, to please his mother and to be a very successful scholar. And he was tremendous. I mean, he won a doctorate, not an honorary doctorate, but a real doctorate from the University of Sydney. And that's why he was called Dr. Evatt. But he was a genuine, brilliant intellectual. But he had the flaws that Anne brings out in the book, and Menzies had his flaws. And that's the interesting thing about the book. It shows that these towering figures of my youth, both of whom I admired, Commonwealth scholarships that John and I got were a creation dreamed of by the Labor government and then implemented vigorously by the Menzies government. They weren't a bad system, John, and they produced people like John and me, products of public schools, to have opportunities to go to university, and that was a very important achievement in a sense of both of them.
Thanks, Michael. Let's have a final comment from John Howard, because in a sense you're a beneficiary of Bert Evatt, unintentionally, because Bert Evatt presided over the split of the Labor Party, which in a sense you're a benefit. So let's have just a feeling of you about, we've heard it from Michael about Evatt, the lawyer, a very distinguished lawyer. Give us a feeling about Evatt, the politician. As a politician, you are looking back.
Well, his greatest achievement was to defeat the referendum, because he thought it involved a huge assault on human rights. And Michael's correct about it. I mean, I can debate him about the UN, but we don't have time. But that was an enormous achievement. But he lost his political judgment after he lost the 1954 election. And the statement he issued attacking the industrial groups and the influence, effectively, of Catholics in the Labor Party, terribly split the Labor Party, was the principal cause of the great split. And I might interpolate here that if the Labor Party had had the constitution, the federal constitutional structure of the Liberal Party, the split would never have occurred, because the federal executive of the Liberal Party has no power to disband a state division. We are still not necessarily something that makes me totally comfortable, because I'm a bit of a centralist, but we are, former premiers shouldn't grin at that, because it means that they agree with me. Hello, Barry, great to see you. But he was a person who, he lost his judgment then, and of course he magnified that loss of judgment with his attack on the Royal Commission. The Molotov embrace was just unbelievable. When you think about it, Molotov was, he about as close. He'd been Soviet foreign minister for so long, and he'd survived the in that position. He'd survived the death of Stalin, the brief interregnum of Malenkov, and then so on, Khrushchev. So I thought his judgment, and politics does involve a lot of judgment, and part of that judgment is how you handle people, and you've got to be a team player. Menzies was far more of a team player the second time around. I probably was the second time around. You learn. You've got to. You can't do it all yourself, and it was and I think he learnt that, and that was one of Hawke's great virtues. I mean, I regard Hawke as the greatest Labor Prime Minister. I stress the adjective that this country has had, but he had great people skills. He had great judgment, and that was something that Bert Evatt lacked. But I don't want to denigrate his intellect. I think he was an extraordinary figure, and he did champion human rights to the end, and that's something you've got to respect.
There is a documentary in this book, another documentary,
Yes.
and John and I will both contribute.
You both contribute.
I'm not financing it. Are you doing
ABC.
the ABC?
Well, Ever the Salmon, Michael Kirby finishes this little exchange. Look, I'll be very brief. Thanks for a fascinating night. I probably should excuse myself, Michael. I was brought up a Roman Catholic, although Rome was a long way away. At any rate, so thanks to Anne for the book, and there was a fascinating exchange tonight from both Michael Kirby and John Howard, two highly extinguished, highly intelligent Australians, both authors in their own right of important books, but tonight discussing another book, and we're all very grateful with the Sydney Institute that they turned up and you all turned up, and it was a wonderful night. I think will live on in history. Actually, it's been recorded because it's pretty rare you get this kind of contribution in a highly intelligent and considered way of two very important Australians who agree on some things and disagree on other things, but can do it civilly, which is what the Sydney Institute's been about now for over 30 years. So thanks for coming, folks. So Anne's going to be down there buying books. Michael's going to be walking around the room compelling people to buy them. And John Howard's going home for a whiskey, I think.